that Jean Valjean has been his savior on the barricade.
Alle kanna full. Unnskyld meg, monsieur, du trenger ikke lenger nå. Gir en grunn til deg jeg er. Mer i pavens konge, mer i bomsens bank. Her med slam og blod at mus er fars beste far. Ja, lukta gir en salig rus. Ja, noen må jo gjøre rent igjen. Likisme på gater, lov orden snudd opp ned. Byen må jo ha fallsansvarsmenn. Gjelder søppel her jeg med. Ting. Synd å la han ligge, ja det ville vært lei. Takk for alt som jeg får ta, for jeg tar det ur. Ja, du har et tur. Et kort liv er en uting, men et kort og godt er greit. Bare klokka tikker bra. Ja, noen må jo få vekk ruske her. For raske skal julas, sånn at nye liv får gro. Men det trengs litt skjønner til det vær. Et smerper bort av blod. For ei vær er en vunnet en hund. Og ei drep for en bit av et bein. Og Gud i sin himmel, han gjør seg et pass. For han er like daud som han er. Jeg ser mot himmelen, alt jeg ser der, er månen som glår på meg. Jeg feser på
It opened at the Barbican Theatre on, I think, October the 7th, 1985. And it was an extraordinarily tense opening because it's an enormously long show, and we ended up with only having about 7 previews. And there were masses of sequence that had to be telescoped after a 10-week rehearsal period. But it was, in the end, I believe, exactly the right place for Les Misérables to have been done, because I think the development of the material needed that unique contribution that a great subsidised company can give you in the way that people approach the work, as opposed to just rehearsing in a rehearsal room for a commercial show. But it was a unique thing in that the arrangement between myself and the Royal Shakespeare Company was such that all my top staff people who were working on a musical worked at the RSC or with the RSC. And what we got, I think, out of the RSC was the art, and what we put into the RSC was the expertise, because it could never be treated like the RSC's fun end-of-term musical. It had to have all the disciplines of a full-scale musical stroke opera. And I think that's why it's worked.
The critical response was very, very interesting. Standing in this very conservatory above the Barbican, we had our first night party, and it was a tumultuous occasion. Everybody was very, very happy, and there was a buzz in the air. The audience and actors and entrepreneurs alike had all felt that we had achieved something very remarkable, very special, fresh, new. Nothing had happened anything like it before. We had just had an absolutely massive standing ovation at the end of the show, and we were right up in the air. So we were not prepared for the next day, when we were manifestly dumped on by the British critics, most of them. And it was a very interesting response, because the posh papers said that we had trivialized one of the greatest works of Western literature, that great novels like Les Misérables were not to be tinkered with, and they were not the proper subject for musicalization. The tabloids agreed between themselves that we had perpetrated a gloomy, dull, endless evening, which wasn't what musicals were about at all. Musicals should be light and frothy and frivolous evenings that sent everybody away happy and humming the tunes. So we fell about as resoundingly and noisily between two stools as any theatre company can ever have done. The audience response, on the other hand, continued to be ovationary.
We opened at the Barbican with a slightly below average advance, which was less than a third of the booking period for the 8 weeks we were there, than they would normally have for any major new Shakespeare in the autumn season. And which made me laugh when all the critics wrote, you know, when they didn't like it, that this was an obvious commercial ploy of the RSC. How dare they sell their birthright? We're doing this obviously commercial musical, which it wasn't.
So we had a few very nervous days when we were deeply worried about our transfer chances. And Cameron Mackintosh went around looking white as a sheet, wondering how many of his houses to mortgage in order to pay for the transfer. And in the end, well, just a few days later, it became absolutely apparent that the audiences were disagreeing with the critics.
I remember having my traditional post-opening lunch, and we all arrived at 12:30, and the candles had become very black indeed on the table. And I thought, I'll get the worst of it out of the way. I will ring the box office and find out just how badly we're doing after these dreadful notices. And I got through eventually, and they said, how on earth did you get through? We'd just had the biggest day in the history of the Barbican and sold 5,000 tickets in the first 3 hours. And that was the first real indication I had that Les Misérables was going to be a popular success and not one made by the critics. In fact, history was repeating itself with the birth of the original novel. When the show went to America, we had, in fact, to sell it twice. We had to sell it once in Washington at the Opera House, where it was going for 8 weeks before we opened on Broadway in March '87. And we also obviously had to pick up an advance in Broadway. The main way that we did that was to complement the word of mouth that was already coming over and the very good notices that we'd received in things like Time and Newsweek and the New York Times, by putting together a film which was just a 6-minute sort of dip into the story of Les Misérables. We just used stills from the London production and some of the very evocative music, and we made this film and showed it to the group sales representatives both in Washington and New York, and that was one of the main reasons that we were able to build up such an impregnable advance. I mean, it did open with, at the time, the biggest advance that Broadway had ever had, and I was delighted that it was eclipsed by Phantom.